All right, guys, we're going to start chapter 26, the Cold War. I'm actually very sad we're not going to be in school for this one. This is one of my favorite topics in all of the course to teach. I'm a big Cold War buff. I'm really a lot of the weapons and stuff that I thought are really cool and stuff, that I used to read a lot about when I was a kid. My father served in the military during the Cold War. His job involved nuclear weapons, so it's one of those things I'm a bit of a dork about. So I'm kind of sad we're not going to be in class to cover it, but I will try to do it justice. We're going to cover chapter 26. And then we're going to jump, I'll just go ahead and, again, spoiler, we're going to jump to chapter 30 after we cover this chapter. We're going to cover the Vietnam War. Then we'll have a test over World War II, Cold War, Vietnam War. And again, I've said this previously, the Cold War is the reason we had Vietnam. If there's no Cold War, there's no Vietnam. And it seems kind of silly to do the Cold War and then do civil rights and John F. Kennedy and some other stuff, and then all of a sudden be like, oh, and there was this thing called Vietnam, and kind of do a bunch of double backing. So we're going to do the Chapter 26 Cold War stuff, and then we're going to roll into the Vietnam War. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Cold War. First of all, what is the Cold War? The Cold War is it is actually the first event in our book that I can live to say I saw. I saw the end of the Cold War. I was 10 years old when the Soviet Union collapsed. So I was actually 11 years old, if you want to get really technical. I was 11 years old by the time the Soviet Union basically disbanded or officially collapsed and fell apart. But I was alive for the last few years of the Cold War. I don't have a whole lot of distinct memories, per se. About it. It wasn't, I wouldn't say exactly the defining characteristic of my childhood, because the Cold War had changed a lot by the time I was old enough to really know what was going on, and the Soviet Union was dying. But the Cold War is the term we give to a sort of standoff or a period of extended tension between the United States and her allies and the Soviet Union and her allies. Most historians would say 1946 to 1991 might be a good way to kind of categorize the Cold War. Some people say, oh, 1989, okay, whatever. Roughly speaking, we'll go ahead and just do our pen here. I don't know why it was so hard for me to find a pen. Okay, we'll call it 1946 to 1991. 45 years of history where the two superpowers kind of stared at each other. All right. Now, there's several ways to kind of view it. I personally view the Cold War as an unavoidable consequence of the rise of the Soviet Union and the United States. I think we had to have a Cold War because the two sides are intractable. They're irreconcilable. Our way and their ways are mutually exclusive. Our belief set and their belief set don't work together. And so it was kind of unavoidable that we would break up and stop being friends. And that's where we're going to start. Where does the Cold War come from? Where does this originate from? How did these two countries who had been allies to fight Nazi Germany, how did they become enemies? So relatively quickly, too. Well, it all goes back to we have different views of the world. As the war began to end, the Soviets, they had a different set of concerns and goals and values. You have to remember that these are a people who have been the victims of German invasions twice in a lifetime. The Germans invaded in 1914. The Germans surprise invaded them in 1941. This most recent invasion in 1941, as I said in the last lecture, 25.5, killed over 12% of the Russian population. I mean, over 23 million Russians died as a result of that German invasion in 1941. Needless to say, they aren't in a forgiving mood. you have to add to that the fact the Russians are historically insecure. They're historically a paranoid people. History hasn't been kind to them. Theirs has been a land which has been invaded from all directions throughout history. Their neighbors have always seemed to have had an eye on them. And so, they just continued on with this historical insecurity to the West. It's the West is always coming after them, is the way they look at it. They're not invading the West. The West always comes at them, whether it be in the form of Napoleon or it be in the form of, the Austrian Empire once upon a time, or, the Germans. And so they are concerned about safety and security. And they want to create a buffer. They want to create basically a line of countries between them and the West to serve as sort of a shield, right? Someone who will absorb the bullets before the bullets actually hit Russia. They want the countries around the Soviet Union to be allies of the Soviet Union and will serve as sort of insulation for the Soviet Union. You also have to remember they are communists. And if you were to read the Communist Manifesto, which you do in my modern European history class, communism is a political and economic view that is based around the concept of internationalism and spread. It's the view of eventually the world will be communist. Communism is not a view that believes, we will be communist. It is a belief system that kind of argues everyone will one day be communism. Like the end goal of communism is to make the world communist. And so there is a desire to spread their system. They did believe their system was superior. They thought that eventually, as Karl Marx predicted in the Communist Manifesto, that one day communism would replace capitalism. And so the Soviets were all about encouraging the spread of communism in neighboring states and anywhere around the world that they could. And so they don't really like us. In their worldview, we are the long-term enemy, right? In their world, we are the bad guy at the end of the day. We're the guy that they have to defeat to get what they want. Okay, so let's jump over to the Americans. While the Soviets are focused on insecurity and they want safety and buffers and allies, America had a different view. What had caused World War II? Depression. That is what caused World War II in our eyes. What opened the door to the dictators? The Great Depression, economic collapse, things of that nature. Without the Great Depression, there's no Hitler, there's no Mussolini, there's none of those folks. Because if you remember our coverage of talking about the rise of some of these folks, the rise of military power in Japan, the rise of Mussolini, the rise of Hitler, they were all based around basically the economies in those countries began to struggle, if not fail, and those men stood up and took advantage of that anger. And they pointed the finger and they said, I'll fix it, just give me a shot, right? And people gave in to them. Without economic collapse, there never would have been a rise to those dictators. Japan never would have gone empire building because there would have been no need to go empire building. So for the Americans, we view economic prosperity as the key to securing peace. Prosperous countries are peaceful countries. Why? They have nothing to gain from war. If you think about war historically, the reasons that people go to war are for religious or ideological differences, right? We just don't agree with the other guy. Or we want something the other guy has. We're looking for resources, farmland, oil, gold, whatever it might be, people to capture to use as slaves. Whatever it might be, we're looking to get something out of it. If our country is prosperous, we've got good trade arrangements, we have everything that we want, we have no real outstanding needs, there's no reason for us to go to war. Even if we don't have it, it's probably cheaper for us to negotiate a trade deal than it is to fight for it, because wars are so expensive in the long run. So we were big firm believers that we've got to create economic growth and prosperity if we want to have peace. By the way, democracy is also a key to promoting peace and stability in our world, in our eyes, in our belief set. Again, this is the way the United States looks at the world. Democracy is key because democratic nations tend to be more peaceful. Why? Well, first of all, democratic nations have to listen to the people. And by and large, people are reluctant to just go to war right off the bat. Because you have to win elections, you've got to keep people happy, and getting their sons killed willy-nilly is not a way to keep people happy. So we believe that democratic people are happy people. They are less likely to lash out. Democratic governments tend to be happier countries. They're less likely to lash out. Prosperous countries. So we're looking at a way to prevent future war. That was what we're focused on. These guys are focused on safety and security. We're focused on promoting economic growth and democracy, right? Now, you could actually start to see the beginnings of some of the problems as early as 1945. In February of 1945, the big three, Mr. Churchill, Mr. Roosevelt, and Mr. Stalin, met at Yalta on the Black Sea coast in Russia. They had a conference. The war in Europe was winding down. It wasn't over, but it was winding down. And they had a few things they had to hash out. First issue, Poland. You might remember Poland was invaded in 1939. Well, when the Germans invaded, the actual Polish government fled. They got on a boat and hightailed it to England. And they'd been living in England ever since, in exile. So the leadership of Poland prior to the start of World War II was still alive. They were just in England. Well, unfortunately for that Polish government, the Russians were the ones who actually invaded Poland who liberated Poland, I should say, and drove the Germans out in 1944. And as the Russian army rolled in, they brought various communist leaders to power. There was a communist party in Poland, like there was a communist party everywhere, and the Russians supported and promoted these communist politicians to rise to levels of control and power in the newly liberated Poland. By 1944, you basically have two governments. You have the government in exile, that was the pre-war government, and you have what's called the Lublin government, named after the city where it was gathered, and that's the pro-communist government. So you've got this government of communists, the Soviets back, you've got the pre-war government. Who's really the government of Poland? Roosevelt and Churchill both argued the Poles have to be able to choose their own government, or this was all for nothing. As Winston Churchill liked to remind and point out to everybody, this is what we went to war against Germany for. Stalin, though, quickly pointed out he needed Poland to be a friend of the Soviet Union, all right? Everybody forgot magically that the Russians helped invade Poland. There's a lot of magically forgetting things after World War II when it comes to the Soviets. But Stalin went as far as to say that the future, that the Polish government being friendly to the Soviet Union was a, quote, matter of life and death, right? And so this was a hot topic. Eventually, the two sides agreed to a compromise. The Russian communist government would actually become the government, but they would allow some of the original pre-war government leadership to take positions in the government. So it would be a blended government, maybe still a slight majority communist, but it would be a blend of the old government and the new communist government, and there was a pledge to have elections as soon as possible in Poland. Speaking of elections, at Yalta, Churchill and Stalin drafted Declaration of Liberated Europe, where they asserted the, quote, right of all people to choose the form of government under which they will live. This was basically a big old promise to get everybody a chance to vote and have democracy and choose their government. The right to create democratic institutions of their own choice, as the pledge said. At the earliest possible establishment through free elections. Now, the Soviets, of course, eagerly signed on to this. The Americans and the British, no doubt. Joseph Stalin, I think, had no intention of following through on this, because let's think about this. Who votes communist? Who, when given the choice of America or the Soviet Union, is going to go, yeah, Soviet Union, that's looking good. And so that's one of these things where historians looking back on it are like, how dumb were Churchill and Roosevelt to think that Joey Stalin was really going to hold up his end on this? But they did commit to the Declaration of Liberated Europe, where they pledged to open the door to democracy. Now, I would like to point out, there's nothing there saying that people couldn't vote to become communist. It's just we're going to let them vote. Also, the conference now has to sit down and draft up how we're going to divide Germany. This is something that you might remember we pledged way back at the Tehran conference, way back in 1943, that we would divide up Germany, that this time Germany is going to get carved up so a large, powerful, militaristic Germany does not reemerge. Germany would be divided into 4 zones. There'd be one for each of the major allies. We're including France in this game now. Britain, France, the United States, the Soviet Union would all get a zone. We would also take the capital city of Berlin and divide it into zones as well, so everybody would get a slice of Germany. We're going to get to this Soviet complaint here in 1 second. Here's the map of the proposed division of Germany. As you can see, the Russians would get the eastern sector, the British the northwestern, the French the one that basically borders France, and America would get southern Germany. And here's the capital city of Berlin, divided into 4 sectors as well. And yes, the Americans got to magically have control of the cities of Bremen and Hamburg, if I remember correctly. But anyhow, the Soviet issue was this zone was less than wealthy. Eastern Germany is agricultural. The industrial heartland of Germany is here. This is where most of Germany's machinery, coal, iron, most of her wealth and resources were located in the western zones. The eastern zone was basically poor farmland. Now, we had said that you could take reparations. Yes, we're bringing back reparations. Joseph Stalin, though, said, look, my country was destroyed by these people. I need to take any and everything I can from my zone to rebuild the Soviet Union. And again, the problem is it is an agricultural region. It's poor. And one thing Roosevelt did say, you have to make reparations something they can pay, they can afford. We made that mistake at the end of World War I. We gave them a bill they'd never be able to pay off. When Joseph Stalin complained that there wasn't enough agricultural goods, Roosevelt said, hey, you could, if there's not, I need to back up, if there's not enough money, right, if they don't have enough wealth, if the region that you took is too poor, you can take stuff. You can take food. You can take machinery. You can take whatever. Now, doing this is going to be a bigger issue coming up because the Soviets will strip it bare and they will still want more because their zone was very poor. But the Allies said, go ahead, remove stuff if you want. Take train cars, take machinery, move factories. And the Soviets did. They literally stripped Eastern Germany of all of its resources, basically. But it still wasn't enough, which is going to be an argument at Potsdam, but we're not there yet. After Yalta, everybody walked away thinking, good, we've got a plan for the future. We're all good. And then the Soviets turn right around and kind of betray us. They promised to make the government of Poland a blended government. They're not going to follow through on that. First, in Romania, 2 weeks after Yalta, the Soviets pressured the king of Romania to appoint a communist government, basically a communist prime minister and all this other stuff. We said that's a violation of the Declaration of a Liberated Europe. The people of Poland didn't vote for that. Of Romania didn't vote for that. You forced that on the people of Romania. And then when they said they were going to make a blended government, they created a new 18-member Polish government. Only 3 of the non-communist Polish government officials were allowed in. So it's 15-3 communist. And on April 1st, President Roosevelt actually contacted the Soviets and said, that's not what you promised. That's not what you said you would do. You guys have gone back on your word. Before any real resolution could occur, Roosevelt had a stroke and he died, which leaves Harry Truman in charge. Harry Truman inherits this weird situation. Harry Truman has no background with Joseph Stalin. As I said in the last presentation, he had only recently become Vice President of the United States. He has very little experience with this kind of international diplomacy. But he does have a different view of things. He believes World War II is not about economics necessarily. Yes, economics is probably part of it. But he believes that World War II was also the result of British appeasement. He took the stance of, look, you guys had time and time again where you could have stopped Hitler, right? Where you could have checked his advances, where you could have told him, nope, that's it. You kept drawing lines and letting him cross the lines, and drawing lines and letting him cross the lines. And that's what made World War II World War II. He felt that the British had allowed that to occur, and he said, we must stand up to the Russians or we will repeat that. We can't allow Joseph Stalin to keep crossing the line, lying, cheating, doing whatever, and getting away with it. And so, Harry Truman famously called the foreign minister, the Soviet foreign minister, in and kind of gave him a little yelling at, something that had never occurred under FDR, kind of letting them know there was a new sheriff in town. Shortly after the war in Europe ended, in the summer of 1945. The big three met at a suburb of Berlin called Potsdam. Actually, it's a different big three. It's no longer Churchill, FDR, and Stalin. It's still Stalin, but now it's Truman, and there's a new British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. They meet at Potsdam. The big thing to talk about is the future of Germany. Now that the war in Germany is over, and now that the war in Europe is over, it's time to really work out the final details of Germany. Harry Truman wanted to make sure that the Germans did not completely destroy Germany. Because Harry Truman was afraid that if Germany were brutally crushed and destroyed of all economics and resources and turned into basically an undeveloped third world, that would be a vacuum in the middle of Europe. And it would become a very unstable, unhealthy place, and nothing good would come of it. And he kind of took the stance of, that's a breeding ground for either a communist revolution or a new dictator to rise up. Again, doing the whole, look what they did to us, let's go get revenge, yeehaw. And so he wanted to prevent the Russians from stripping Germany bare of all resources and industry. Germany, on the other hand, in the eyes of Stalin and his advisors, should pay the price for World War II and should be devastated. They never wanted to have to again face German aggression, not to mention they have a country to rebuild. And so at the conference, Joseph Stalin was pushing for more and more and more reparations. And as I was kind of touching upon earlier at Yalta, Eastern Germany is relatively industrially poor, and there's not a lot of industry and resources that the Russians could take advantage of. With plenty of food, not a lot else. So at the Potsdam Conference, when Joseph Stalin kept pushing, Harry Truman said if the Russians wanted more industrial reparations, they would have to pay for it. They'd have to trade food from the East to get resources from the West. And even then, it would have to be voluntary. You couldn't force the Germans of Western Germany to give up their resources in exchange for food if they didn't want it. Basically, the Western powers were taking the stance that they were going to allow Western Germany to recover somewhat. Joseph Stalin was not very happy with this compromise being offered, right? Trading food for industry. But there's no real other choice. Harry Truman did offer to accept a new Polish-German border that the Soviets had proposed. But that was about it. Joseph Stalin's back is against the wall, though. Harry Truman's playing hardball. And unless the Soviets want to go to war with the United States of America over German reparations, they're going to have to take it or leave it. The American army is in West Germany, not the Russians. Also, another thing historians have pointed out, Harry Truman found out about the successful atomic bomb test while he was at Potsdam. They tested the Trinity test in New Mexico for the atomic bomb, and Harry Truman got a coded message. The actual message was, it's a boy. There was a long story behind this, but to let him know that the bomb test was successful, they sent him a telegram letting him know that a friend of his wife, who was pregnant at the time, had the baby, and it was a boy, and that was to let him know the bomb had worked. He knows he's got the atomic bomb, so Harry Truman played a little more hardball at Potsdam. He's got his ace up his sleeve. No one else there knew what he knew. Joseph Stalin, though, accepted the deal. He doesn't really have a choice. Like I said, American and British troops are in the middle of West Germany, and there's no way for the Soviets to get reparations except taking this deal. And so here we are. Adolf Hitler's only been dead a few months, and you can already see the relationship is starting to fall apart because the common enemy that bound us together is now dead. While Harry Truman won the battle over West German reparations, the rest of Europe does not fare so well. Yes, the Soviets helped write the Declaration of Liberated Europe, but they didn't uphold it. The Soviet army liberated or conquered Eastern Europe, and everywhere they went, they slowly but surely instituted pro-Soviet communist governments in Poland, in Czechoslovakia, in Romania, in Hungary, in Bulgaria. In all of these countries, they set up pro-communist governments. These became known as satellite nations. They were in the Soviet orbit, as we like to call it, meaning they theoretically were independent, but they were being controlled, influenced, pulled by the Soviet Union. Yes, they had their own governments, but their governments acted in ways that were approved and even in some ways designed by the Soviet Union. They were allies of the Soviet Union militarily. They did basically all of their economic deals with the Soviet Union. They're Soviet puppets for all intents and purposes. As we watched the Soviets take control of Eastern Europe, Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946. And it was in this speech in Fulton, Missouri where he coined a phrase. The quote in your book, the excerpt from his speech: "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. All are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and increasing measure of control from Moscow." And there it was at the very start, an iron curtain. This became the unofficial phrase to mark the line that divided communist Eastern Europe from non-communist Western Europe. No, there was no actual wall or curtain made of iron. It's just an expression. But by 1946, the Cold War has kind of begun to settle in. The freeze has begun. We are not the buddies we once were. And we will look at how that relationship continued to deteriorate and how we're going to respond to it in the next section in 26.2.